They weren't just boots, they were a lifeline. On a freezing El Paso night, an 83-year-old man's desperate plea for warmth would lead to an act of kindness that defied all expectations. The wind howled down Montana Avenue, a biting wind that seemed to slice through the thin layers of clothing most El Pasoans wore. It was a December night, the kind where the desert chill seeped into your bones, making even a short walk feel like an Arctic expedition. El Paso, a city known for its scorching summers, was in the grip of an unusually harsh winter. The bright fluorescent lights of the Lowe's home improvement store on the edge of town seemed like a beacon in the growing darkness, a promise of warmth against the encroaching cold. Charles Holder, 83 years old, shuffled along the sidewalk, his breath misting in the frigid air. Each step was a battle against the stiffness in his joints, the ache in his worn-out sneakers a dull, throbbing counterpoint to the wind's icy sting. He'd been on his feet most of the day, trying to find a place, any place, to escape the cold that threatened to overwhelm him. His thin jacket offered little protection, and he clutched it tighter around his frail frame, a shiver racking his body. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Pride, a stubborn pride he'd carried all his life, warred with the gnawing hunger in his belly. He'd seen better days, of course. He'd worked hard, raised a family, but life had dealt him a cruel hand in his later years. A series of misfortunes, a lost job, a dwindling savings account, and then the streets. He refused to dwell on it, focusing instead on the immediate need, shelter. Inside Lowe's, the air was thick with the scent of lumber and freshly cut Christmas trees. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a stark, clinical glow on the aisles of tools, appliances, and home improvement supplies. Maria, a cashier who'd been working at Lowe's for 5 years, saw him first. He was standing near the entrance, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around nervously. He looked lost, vulnerable, like a stray animal caught in a storm. She felt a pang of sympathy. It wasn't uncommon to see homeless people seeking refuge in the store, especially on cold nights. But there was something about this man's quiet dignity that set him apart. David, a young stocker, noticed the way Charles was shivering. He'd seen homeless people before, many times, but there was something about this man's quiet dignity, the way he held himself, that struck him. Charles approached the customer service desk hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cracking with cold and fatigue. "Would it be all right if I just stayed here until closing? I won't cause any trouble. I just need to get out of the cold for a little while." He looked down at his worn shoes, avoiding eye contact, as if ashamed of his request. He knew he was asking for a favor, a small concession, but in his current state, even that felt like too much to ask. A customer, a burly man in a Carhartt jacket, overheard the conversation. He reached into his wallet. "Sir," he said, holding out a $20 bill, "let me give you some money, please." Charles looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and a deep-seated pride. No, thank you," he said, his voice firm despite its tremor. "I appreciate that very much, but I can't." "Please," the customer insisted. "It is very cold. You need—" Charles shook his head. "I don't want to end up in jail or in a hospital," he said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "I've been in both, and they're not fun places to be when you're my age. I just need to be warm." He repeated himself, the plea raw and honest. Concerned and unsure how to proceed, Maria called the store manager, who in turn decided to call the police. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but they felt it was the best way to ensure Charles's safety in the stores. When Charles saw the police car pull up outside, its lights flashing silently in the night, his heart sank. He'd had run-ins with the law before, mostly for vagrancy. He braced himself for the worst. He imagined spending the night in a cold jail cell, his aching bones protesting with every movement. He'd be another statistic, another nameless face in the system. Officer Flores, a young man with a kind face and empathetic eyes, approached Charles slowly, his hands visible and open. He didn't bark orders or make demands. He simply asked, "Sir, are you all right?" His voice was calm, reassuring, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Charles's chest. Flores noticed the thin jacket, the worn shoes, the way Charles was trying to huddle in on himself for warmth. He saw not a vagrant, but a man, an elderly man, in desperate need of help. Instead of asking about his ID or lecturing him about loitering, Flores asked, "What size shoe do you wear, sir?" The question caught Charles completely off guard. He stammered, "I don't size 10, I think." Without a word, Officer Flores turned and walked back into the store. Charles watched him go, a flicker of hope, however faint, igniting within him. Flores returned a few minutes later with a pair of sturdy, leather work boots, lined with thick insulation. They weren't just any boots. They were the kind designed to withstand the harshest conditions, the kind of boots that could protect a man's feet from the bitterest cold. And 3 pairs of thick, wool socks, Flores added, placing them gently beside the boots. Charles stared at the boots, his eyes welling up with tears. He hadn't expected this. Not in a million years. He hadn't expected kindness, compassion, from a police officer. He'd expected to be treated like a criminal, a nuisance, a burden. He reached out a trembling hand and touched one of the boots, the leather smooth and strong beneath his fingertips. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." He couldn't find the words to express the depth of his gratitude. Then, Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside were a few crackers, a bruised apple, and a couple of hard candies. It was all he had, his meager dinner, saved for later. "This is all I have," he said, his voice still thick with emotion. "Please take it. It's not much, but—" He offered the bag to Officer Flores, a gesture of reciprocity, a way of saying thank you with the only thing he possessed. Flores smiled gently and shook his head, a silent refusal, a hand placed briefly on Charles's shoulder in a gesture of understanding and reassurance. The act of kindness didn't end there. Officer Flores arranged for Charles to stay at a local shelter for the night. He drove him there himself, ensuring he had a warm bed and a roof over his head. The shelter wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, and most importantly, it was warm. A cot with a thick blanket waited for him. For the first time in days, Charles felt a sense of relief wash over him. He could finally rest, without the fear of the cold gnawing at him, without the constant worry of where he would spend the night. Sergeant Miller, Flores's supervisor, later said, "Officer Flores's actions weren't just commendable. They were a testament to the kind of officer we strive to be. He went above and beyond, showing genuine compassion and empathy." Police Chief Reyes added, "In a time when law enforcement is often under scrutiny, Officer Flores reminds us of the fundamental good that exists within our ranks. He represents the best of us." Officer Flores declined all requests for interviews. He wasn't looking for recognition or praise. He'd simply seen someone in need and done what he felt was right. He didn't consider it heroic. He considered it human. It was a small act of kindness, a pair of boots and a few pairs of socks. But to Charles Holder, it was everything. It was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there was still light to be found, still hope to be had. And it was a reminder to all of us that true heroism doesn't always wear a cape or a badge. Sometimes it wears a uniform and offers a helping hand, quietly, humbly, without expecting anything in return. The warmth of the boots, the kindness of a stranger, had done more than just protect him from the cold. It had rekindled a spark of humanity within him, a spark he thought had long been extinguished. It left a lingering question, a quiet challenge. How many other Charles Holders are out there, tonight, shivering in the cold? And what small act of kindness might make all the difference?